My daughter's husband looked me straight in the eye and said, "The shed has everything you need, Tillie. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I stood there, holding my worn suitcase, watching him lock the door to what used to be my own home. 3 days later, I walked into the county clerk's office with a stack of papers that would change everything. When they realized what I'd done, the frantic calls started pouring in. But by then, I had already made my choice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Tillie Anderson, and at 72 years old, I thought I knew what family meant. I thought I understood the difference between love and convenience, between generosity and being taken advantage of. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I learned the truth the hard way when my own flesh and blood decided I was nothing more than an inconvenience to be swept aside. The Anderson family farm had been in our bloodline for 4 generations. My great-grandfather bought the original 40 acres in 1897 with money he'd saved from working the railroad. My grandfather expanded it to 200 acres during the Depression, somehow managing to hold on to every inch when other families lost everything. My father added another 100 acres after the war, and when I married Robert in 1968, we worked that land together for 37 years until his heart gave out on a cold February morning. After Robert died, I could have sold the farm. Lord knows I had plenty of offers from developers who saw dollar signs in our prime location just outside Millbrook. The land was worth close to $2 million, they said. Prime real estate for suburban development. But this wasn't just land to me. This was where I had buried 3 miscarried babies under the old oak tree. This was where my daughter Sarah took her first steps on the front porch. This was where Robert and I had planned to grow old together, watching grandchildren play in the same fields where we'd worked side by side for decades. Sarah was our miracle baby, born after years of trying and losing. She came into this world on a snowy December night in 1975, screaming loud enough to wake the county. Robert cried harder than she did when the doctor placed her in his arms. We spoiled her, I'll admit that freely. Maybe we spoiled her too much. When you wait so long for something precious, you tend to protect it with everything you have. She was smart as a whip, graduated valedictorian from Millbrook High, got a full scholarship to State University for agriculture business. We were so proud watching her walk across that stage, thinking she'd come back and help us modernize the farm operation. She had big dreams about organic farming and direct-to-consumer sales. We'd stay up late planning how to convert the old barn into a farm store, talking about which fields would be best for the vegetable plots she wanted to start. But college changed her. She came home for Christmas her sophomore year with different clothes, a different accent, different ideas about what she wanted from life. Suddenly, farming was backwards. Rural life was limiting. She wanted culture, sophistication, opportunities. She switched her major to marketing and started dating boys whose fathers owned businesses instead of dirt. I tried not to take it personally. "Young people need to find their own way," Robert would say. "She'll come around when she's ready." But she never did come around. She graduated, moved to the city, got a job at some advertising firm. Her visits home became shorter and less frequent. She'd spend most of her time on her phone, complaining about the slow internet and the lack of good restaurants within 30 miles. Then she met Marcus. Marcus Whitfield was everything Robert and I weren't. Polished, educated, ambitious. He wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment and drove a BMW that he was always worried about getting dirty on our gravel driveway. He worked in finance, something to do with investment portfolios and market analysis that I never quite understood. He was handsome in a catalog model way, with perfectly styled hair and teeth so white they looked artificial. When Sarah brought him home for the first time, I tried my best to make him feel welcome. I cooked a big Sunday dinner with all the trimmings, used my good china, even bought wine because Sarah mentioned he was particular about that sort of thing. Marcus sat at our kitchen table picking at my pot roast like it might poison him, making comments about how quaint everything was. Quaint. That's what he called the home Robert and I had built with our own hands. The kitchen where I'd canned thousands of jars of vegetables from our garden. The living room where we'd celebrated every Christmas and birthday for 40 years. Quaint, like we were some sort of historical exhibit he was visiting. But Sarah was glowing beside him, hanging on his every word, laughing at jokes I didn't find funny. She was 26 and head over heels in love, and I wanted her to be happy. So I bit my tongue when he made snide remarks about small-town life. I smiled when he explained to Robert how farming was becoming obsolete in the modern economy. I even thanked him when he offered to connect us with a good realtor who could help us liquidate our assets and relocate somewhere more practical. They got engaged 6 months later. Sarah called to tell me over the phone instead of coming home to share the news in person. She was breathless with excitement, talking about venues and caterers and a dress that cost more than Robert and I had spent on our entire wedding. When I asked if they'd set a date, she said they were thinking spring, maybe at some resort in California where Marcus had connections. California. Not the little Methodist church, where 3 generations of Anderson women had been married. Not surrounded by the community that had watched her grow up. California, because Marcus thought a destination wedding would be more sophisticated. I offered to help pay for the wedding. It seemed like the right thing to do, the motherly thing. Sarah got quiet on the phone, then said they were handling everything themselves because Marcus wanted to keep things elegant and cohesive. I understood what she meant without her having to spell it out. My money was good enough, but my input wasn't wanted. The wedding was beautiful, I'll give them that. Sarah looked like a princess in her designer gown, and Marcus looked every inch the successful young businessman in his tailored tuxedo. I wore the nicest dress I owned and felt underdressed the entire time. Most of the guests were Marcus's colleagues and Sarah's new city friends. I knew maybe a dozen people out of the 150 who attended. During the reception, I overheard Marcus talking to some of his friends about Sarah's background. He called her his diamond in the rough, said it was amazing how she'd overcome her humble origins to become such a sophisticated woman. Humble origins. Like being raised with love and values and hard work was something to be ashamed of. I should have said something then. Should have pulled Sarah aside and asked her if this was really what she wanted, if this man who was embarrassed by where she came from was really worth building a life with. But she looked so happy cutting the cake and dancing to songs I'd never heard before. Who was I to spoil her perfect day with my concerns? They moved to Chicago after the honeymoon. Marcus had gotten some big promotion that required relocating, and Sarah was excited about living in a real city with culture and opportunities. She got a job at a marketing firm there, started posting pictures on social media of their sleek downtown apartment and trendy restaurant meals. Her visits home became even more infrequent, maybe twice a year if I was lucky. Robert and I adjusted to the quiet. We'd always known Sarah would leave eventually, but we'd hoped she'd stay closer to home. We threw ourselves into the farm work, tried some of those direct sales ideas Sarah had talked about in college. We started selling at the farmer's market in town, built up a steady customer base for our tomatoes and sweet corn. It wasn't the same as having family close by, but it was something. When Robert had his heart attack 3 years later, Sarah came home for the funeral. She stood beside me at the graveside service, holding my hand while they lowered the man who'd raised her into the ground. Marcus didn't come. He had an important client meeting, Sarah explained. Couldn't be rescheduled. Business was business. After the service, people came back to the house like always happens in small towns when someone dies. The ladies from church brought casseroles and desserts. The neighbors shared stories about Robert and offered to help with whatever I needed. Sarah fluttered around in her black designer dress, accepting condolences with the gracious smile she'd perfected in her new life. When everyone had gone home and it was just the two of us, Sarah sat me down at the kitchen table and started talking about my future. She was worried about me living alone on such a big property. What if something happened? What if I had an accident and no one found me for days? Wouldn't I be happier somewhere smaller, more manageable? Maybe one of those nice senior communities in town? I told her I wasn't ready to think about moving. This was my home, Robert's home, our family's legacy. I could manage the farm work, hire help when I needed it. I was only 69 years old and in good health. I had years left in me. Sarah patted my hand like I was a confused child and said we'd talk about it more later. She had to get back to Chicago, back to her important job and her important husband. She'd call me soon, she promised. We'd figure everything out together. But we didn't figure anything out together because Sarah stopped calling regularly after that. Our conversations became brief and infrequent, usually initiated by me. When I'd try to share news about the farm or the community, she'd make polite sounds but change the subject quickly. She was busy with work, with Marcus's career advancement, with their social obligations in the city. I threw myself into keeping the farm running. I hired Tommy Patterson, a young man from town whose family had been farming for generations, to help with the heavy work. I kept up the vegetable sales, expanded into flowers for the farmers market. I joined the garden club, volunteered at the library, stayed active in church. I had a good life, a full life, even without Robert beside me. But I was lonely. I missed having family close by, missed sharing the small daily moments that make up a life. When Sarah did call, I tried to keep the conversation light, not wanting to burden her with my feelings. She had her own life to live, her own challenges to face. Then, 2 years ago, everything changed. Sarah called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice higher and more excited than I'd heard it in years. She had news, big news. She was pregnant. After years of trying, she and Marcus were finally going to have a baby. I cried when she told me.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Happy tears, grateful tears. I was going to be a grandmother. Maybe this would bring us closer together again. Maybe having a child would help Sarah remember what family really meant. The pregnancy went smoothly, and Sarah started calling more often. She wanted advice about baby gear, about what to expect during labor, about all the things first-time mothers worry about. For a few months, it felt like I had my daughter back. We talked about names and nursery themes, and whether breastfeeding was really better than formula. I started knitting blankets and booties, imagining all the ways I'd spoil my grandchild. Little Emma was born on a gorgeous April morning, weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with a head full of dark hair like her mother's. Sarah sent me pictures from the hospital, and I fell in love immediately. This tiny perfect person was part of me, part of Robert, part of our family legacy. I drove to Chicago the week after Emma was born, my car loaded with gifts and home-cooked meals for the new parents. I stayed in a hotel because their apartment was too small for guests, but I spent every day at their place, helping with feedings and diaper changes and laundry. Sarah was exhausted and overwhelmed, and I was grateful to be useful again. Marcus tolerated my presence, though I could tell he wasn't thrilled about having his mother-in-law around for a week. He made comments about my old-fashioned methods and suggested I might be more comfortable staying in the guest room at the hotel instead of camping out on their couch during Emma's cluster feeding sessions. But Sarah seemed grateful for the help, so I ignored his subtle hints that I was overstaying my welcome. When I left to go home, Sarah hugged me tight and thanked me for everything. She promised they'd bring Emma to visit soon, maybe for Easter or Mother's Day. I drove back to the farm with my heart full, already planning all the things I wanted to show my granddaughter when she was old enough to appreciate them. But they didn't come for Easter. Marcus had a golf tournament. They didn't come for Mother's Day either. Sarah's college roommate was getting married in Martha's Vineyard, and it was important for Marcus's networking to attend. They'd come soon, Sarah promised. Maybe for Emma's first birthday, or definitely for Christmas. Emma's first birthday came and went without a visit. Sarah sent pictures of the party they threw in Chicago, complete with a professional photographer, and a cake that looked like it belonged in a magazine. All of Marcus's family was there, his parents and siblings and cousins. I wasn't invited. Too far to travel with a baby, Sarah explained when I called to wish Emma happy birthday. Maybe next year when she's older. I tried to be understanding. I really did. Young families are busy, especially when both parents are working demanding jobs. I satisfied myself with the pictures Sarah sent and the brief video calls where Emma would wave at the camera and babble in her adorable baby language. It wasn't the same as holding her, reading her stories, teaching her about the farm animals, but it was something. Then last Christmas, Sarah called with what she presented as wonderful news. Marcus had been offered an amazing promotion that would require them to relocate again. this time to his company's international division. They'd be moving to London for at least 3 years, maybe longer if things went well. It was an incredible opportunity for his career, a chance to establish himself globally in his field. I felt my heart sink as she talked about the adventure they'd have living abroad, the cultural experiences Emma would get growing up internationally, the prestigious schools she'd be able to attend. When I asked when they'd be leaving, Sarah said within the month. The company was handling all the relocation details, and they wanted Marcus to start as soon as possible. A month. They were moving halfway around the world in a month, taking my granddaughter away from me, and Sarah was talking about it like it was the most exciting thing that had ever happened to them. When I asked about visits, about staying in touch, she assured me that modern technology made distance irrelevant. We could video chat all the time. Emma would know her grandmother even if they couldn't see each other in person very often. But I knew better. I knew that distance changes things, that good intentions don't always survive the demands of busy lives. I'd already been relegated to the margins of their world when they lived just a few hours away. How much more peripheral would I become when they were living on another continent? I wished them well because what else could I do? I helped Sarah research international shipping for their belongings and listened to her excitement about finding an apartment in London and navigating British customs. I bought Emma a special doll to take with her on the airplane and tried to hide my heartbreak behind enthusiasm for their adventure. They left on a cold February morning, and I didn't even get to say goodbye in person. Their flight was early, and Sarah said it would be too complicated to coordinate with my driving to Chicago. We had a video call the night before where Emma blew kisses at the camera, and I pretended my tears were from joy instead of grief. For 6 months, Sarah kept her promise about staying in touch. We had regular video calls where I got to watch Emma taking her first steps in their London apartment and hear her saying new words with the slight British accent she was picking up from her daycare. Sarah would show me around their flat, point out the historic landmarks she could see from their windows, describe the amazing restaurants and cultural events they were discovering. But gradually, the calls became less frequent. Sarah was busy with her new job at Marcus's company's London office. Emma was thriving in her international daycare and making friends with children from all over the world. They were building a life there, establishing roots in soil that was an ocean away from everything I'd ever known. The last time we talked was 3 months ago. Sarah looked tired, stressed about something she didn't want to discuss in detail. Marcus was working long hours trying to prove himself worthy of the promotion. Emma was getting into everything, a typical toddler exploration phase that was exhausting for working parents to manage. When I offered to come visit, to help out like I had when Emma was born, Sarah said it wasn't a good time. Maybe later in the year, when things settled down. I understood, or I tried to understand. But understanding didn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. I was 72 years old, living alone on a farm that felt too big and too quiet without family to fill it. My granddaughter was growing up speaking a different language, living in a different culture, becoming a person I might never really know. That's when I started thinking seriously about Sarah's suggestion from years ago. Maybe I was too old to be rattling around in this big farmhouse by myself. Maybe it was time to sell the land and move somewhere more practical, closer to town where I could have neighbors and community services nearby. But every time I got close to making that decision, I'd walk out to the old oak tree where Robert was buried, where we'd buried our lost babies all those years ago. I'd sit in his workshop, surrounded by the tools he'd used to build our life together. I'd stand in the kitchen where Sarah had eaten countless meals, where she'd done homework at the table while I cooked dinner, where we'd planned her future when she still thought farming might be part of it. How could I sell all of that? How could I erase the physical evidence of our family's history, the tangible connection to my husband and my daughter and my granddaughter? This land wasn't just my home. It was my legacy, the foundation of who I was. But legacy doesn't mean much if there's no one left to inherit it. And at 72, living alone with no family nearby and health that wouldn't stay good forever, I had to face the reality that something needed to change. That's when I got the phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday evening in late September, just after I'd finished cleaning up from dinner. The phone rang, and I saw Sarah's name on the caller ID. My heart lifted immediately. It had been almost 2 weeks since our last conversation, and I'd been missing Emma terribly. But it wasn't Sarah's voice when I answered. It was Marcus, sounding strained and formal like he was reading from a script. "Tillie," he said, using my first name instead of calling me Mom like he had in the early years of their marriage. "I need to talk to you about something important." My first thought was that something had happened to Sarah or Emma. An accident, an illness, some crisis that required my help. My grandmother instincts kicked in immediately. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Is everyone okay?" "Everyone's fine," he said quickly. "It's not that kind of call. It's about you, actually. About your situation there on the farm." "My situation?" I repeated, not understanding what he meant. "Sarah's been worried about you," he continued. "Living alone at your age, managing such a big property by yourself. She thinks it's becoming unsafe, and frankly, so do I. We've been discussing it, and we think it's time for you to consider making a change." I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the same feeling I'd gotten when Sarah first brought up selling the farm after Robert died. But this time was different. This time, Marcus was doing the talking instead of my daughter. "What kind of change?" I asked carefully. "We think you should sell the farm," he said, his voice taking on the confident tone he used when discussing business matters. "The real estate market is hot right now, especially for development properties like yours. You could get top dollar, probably even more than the land is technically worth because of the location and the development potential." I gripped the phone tighter. "Marcus, this is my home. It's been in my family for 4 generations. I understand the sentimental value," he said, like he was humoring a confused elderly person. "But sentiment doesn't pay for healthcare when you need it. Sentiment doesn't help you if you fall and break a hip and can't get to a phone. You need to be practical about your future." I wanted to argue, to tell him that I was perfectly capable of taking care of myself, that I had friends and neighbors who checked on me regularly, that I wasn't ready to give up the life I'd built with Robert. But before I could speak, he continued. "The good news is, we have a solution. We've been looking into some really nice assisted living communities in London. Upscale places, very well regarded, with full medical support and social activities. You could be close to Emma, watch her grow up, be part of her daily life, instead of just seeing her on video calls." "London?" The word came out as barely a whisper. I know it sounds like a big change, but think about it logically. You sell the farm, use the proceeds to secure a place in one of these communities, and you'll have family nearby for the first time in years. Emma could visit you regularly, maybe even stay overnight sometimes when Sarah and I need a babysitter. It would solve everyone's problems. Everyone's problems. As if my attachment to my home, my history, my entire identity was nothing more than a problem to be solved. "I need to think about this," I managed to say. "Of course," Marcus replied smoothly. "Take your time. But don't take too long. The real estate market won't stay hot forever, and some of these assisted living places have waiting lists. The sooner you get the process started, the better positioned you'll be." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone for a long time. Part of me was tempted by the idea of being close to Emma, of watching her grow up instead of missing all the important moments. But the practical part of my mind, the part that had managed a farm for decades, was asking questions Marcus hadn't answered. How much would this assisted living community cost? How long would the money from the farm sale last? What would happen when it ran out? And, most importantly, why hadn't Sarah been the one to call me with this proposal? Why was her husband making plans for my future without her being part of the conversation? I tried calling Sarah the next day, but the call went straight to voicemail. I left a message asking her to call me back, saying I wanted to discuss Marcus's suggestion. She didn't call back that day, or the next. When I tried again a week later, Marcus answered her phone. "She's incredibly busy with a major project at work," he explained. "But we've been talking about your situation, and she agrees that moving to London makes the most sense. In fact, we've already started looking into options for you. There's a lovely place called Meadowbrook Manor that has an opening coming up in January. We could arrange a virtual tour if you'd like to see it." I didn't want a virtual tour. I wanted to talk to my daughter. I wanted to hear from her own lips that this was what she thought I should do, that she really wanted me to uproot my entire life and move to another country to be near them. But Sarah never called me back. Every time I tried to reach her, Marcus answered with another excuse about her being busy, another update about the assisted living research he was doing on my behalf, another reason why this move made perfect sense for everyone involved. After 2 weeks of this, I stopped calling. If my daughter wanted to talk to me, she had my number. If she really wanted me to sell everything I'd ever worked for and move across an ocean to be near them, she could pick up the phone and ask me herself. Instead, what I got was a packet in the mail. It arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by certified mail that required my signature. My name and address were written in Marcus's precise handwriting, and the return address was their London apartment. Inside was a thick folder containing real estate listings for assisted living communities, brochures for senior relocation services, and a detailed financial analysis showing how the sale of my farm could fund my care for an estimated 15 to 20 years. At the bottom of the packet was a handwritten note from Marcus. Tillie, I know this is a lot to process, but Sarah and I really think this is the best path forward for everyone. We've done extensive research, and these communities offer everything you need for a comfortable, safe, and socially engaged retirement. The timeline we're looking at would have you listed the farm by Christmas and relocated by spring. I've included contact information for a realtor who specializes in rural properties and a senior moving consultant who can handle all the logistics. Let me know if you have any questions. No mention of Sarah. No personal message from my daughter explaining why she thought I should sell my home and move to another continent. Just Marcus, taking charge of my life like I was another business problem to be efficiently solved. I set the packet on my kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. Then I got up, walked outside, and stood in the middle of the field where Robert and I used to grow sweet corn. The October air was crisp, and the leaves on the oak trees were turning the brilliant reds and golds that made autumn in Missouri the most beautiful season of the year. This was my land, my home, my history. And Marcus Whitfield, who had never worked a day of manual labor in his life, who thought my life's work was quaint and outdated, who barely tolerated my presence in his wife's life, thought he could package it all up and ship it off to the highest bidder so I could spend my final years warehoused in some sterile facility an ocean away from everything I'd ever known. That evening, I called my lawyer. Harold Brennan had handled the Anderson family's legal affairs for 30 years. He'd drawn up Robert's will, helped us navigate the paperwork when we added the back 40 acres in the 80s, handled the business registration when we started selling at farmers markets. He was Sarah's age, and I'd watched him grow from a young lawyer fresh out of law school to one of the most respected attorneys in the county. When I told him about Marcus's proposal, Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked me what I wanted to do. I want to make sure my wishes are protected, I said. I want to make sure that no one can pressure me into selling this farm unless that's truly what I decide to do. Harold asked me to come in the next day so we could review my current will and discuss my options. When I arrived at his office, he had my file spread across his desk and a serious expression on his face. Tillie, he said, I need to be direct with you about something. If your goal is to preserve this farm for Sarah and Emma, you need to understand that having the property in your name alone doesn't guarantee that outcome. If something happens to you, if you become incapacitated or need expensive medical care, the farm could still end up being sold to pay for your care. And if Sarah inherits it after you're gone, there's nothing to prevent her from selling it immediately. I'd been afraid he might say something like that. What are my options? We could set up a trust, he explained. Transfer ownership of the farm to a family trust with specific conditions about how the property can be used and sold. You could retain the right to live here for the rest of your life, maintain control over day-to-day decisions, but have legal protections in place to ensure the farm stays in the family according to your wishes. That sounded promising, but I had concerns. What if Sarah doesn't want the farm? What if she'd rather have the money than the land? Harold leaned back in his chair. That's a conversation you need to have with her, Tillie, but I can structure the trust to give her options. She could choose to keep the farm and continue the agricultural operation, or she could choose to sell it with the proceeds going to Emma's education and future. The key is that the decision would be made according to your guidelines, not under pressure from outside circumstances. We spent the next hour going over the details. Harold explained how the trust would work, what kind of legal protections it would provide, how it would affect my taxes, and my ability to make decisions about the property. It was complicated, but it made sense. More importantly, it would give me peace of mind knowing that my family's legacy would be protected, even if I wasn't around to defend it. I signed the initial paperwork that day and authorized Harold to begin drafting the trust documents. The process would take several weeks, he explained, but once it was complete, I'd have the security of knowing that the farm's future was legally protected according to my wishes. Driving home from Harold's office, I felt better than I had in weeks. I'd taken action to protect what mattered most to me, and I'd done it without having to justify my decisions to Marcus or anyone else. This was my land, my legacy, and I had every right to determine what happened to it. That evening, I tried calling Sarah one more time. I wanted to tell her about my conversation with Harold, explain why I wasn't ready to sell the farm, maybe even have the honest discussion about our family's future that we should have had months ago. But once again, Marcus answered her phone. "Tillie," he said before I could even ask for Sarah. "Perfect timing. I was just about to call you. We've had some developments on the assisted living front. Meadowbrook Manor had a cancellation, and they can offer you a spot starting in December instead of January. But we need to move quickly. They need a commitment by the end of next week." I took a deep breath. "Marcus, I need to talk to Sarah." "She's at a client dinner," he said smoothly. "But we've discussed this extensively, and she's completely on board with the accelerated timeline. In fact, she's excited about having you nearby for the holidays. Think about it, Tillie. Christmas morning with Emma, helping her open presents, being part of her daily routine instead of just hearing about it secondhand." The picture he painted was tempting, I had to admit. I'd missed so many moments with Emma already, and the thought of being part of her childhood instead of watching it from afar was appealing. But something about Marcus's tone, about the way he kept speaking for Sarah instead of letting her speak for herself, made me uneasy. "I appreciate you looking into options for me," I said carefully. "But this is a big decision, and I need more time to think about it." There was a pause. Then Marcus's voice took on a harder edge. "Tillie, I'm going to be frank with you. Sarah is worried sick about you living alone at your age. Every day she worries about getting a phone call that something has happened to you, that you've fallen or had a medical emergency with no one around to help. It's affecting her work, her health, her ability to focus on being a good mother to Emma." The guilt hit me like a physical blow. The last thing I wanted was to be a source of stress for my daughter, especially when she was trying to balance motherhood and a demanding career in a foreign country. "I don't want to be a burden," I said quietly. "Then don't be," Marcus replied bluntly. "Accept our help. Let us take care of the logistics of relocating you somewhere safe and comfortable, where Sarah won't have to worry about you anymore." The way he said it made me feel like a problem to be solved, rather than a mother who wanted to be close to her family. But maybe that's what I had become. Maybe at 72, living alone on a remote farm, I was more of a liability than an asset to my daughter's life. "Let me think about it over the weekend," I said finally. "Of course," Marcus said, his tone warming slightly. "Take all the time you need. But remember, opportunities like this don't come along often. Meadowbrook Manor is one of the premier facilities in London, and having a spot available with such short notice is almost unheard of." After we hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen and tried to imagine myself living in London. I'd never even been on an airplane, much less lived in a foreign country. I didn't know anything about British culture or customs or healthcare systems. I'd be completely dependent on Sarah and Marcus for everything from navigating the bureaucracy to understanding my legal rights as a resident. But I'd be near Emma. I'd get to watch her grow up, be part of her daily life, create the kind of relationship with my granddaughter that I'd always dreamed of having. Maybe that was worth giving up everything else. I spent the weekend walking around the farm, trying to imagine it without me. The fields would probably be developed into subdivisions, the farmhouse torn down to make room for modern homes with perfectly manicured lawns. The oak tree where Robert was buried would likely be cut down to improve the lot configuration. Everything that had made this place special, everything that connected it to 4 generations of Anderson family history, would disappear as if it had never existed. But maybe that was just the natural order of things. Maybe clinging to the past was selfish when my daughter needed me to be practical about the future. Maybe love sometimes meant letting go of what you wanted so the people you cared about could have what they needed. By Sunday evening, I'd almost convinced myself that Marcus was right. I was getting too old to manage such a big property alone. Sarah did have legitimate reasons to worry about my safety and well-being. Moving to London would solve everyone's problems and give me the chance to be the kind of grandmother I'd always wanted to be. I was reaching for the phone to call Marcus and accept their proposal when it rang. Sarah's name appeared on the caller ID, and for the first time in weeks, it was actually my daughter's voice when I answered. "Mom," she said, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "I'm so sorry I haven't called you back. Work has been absolutely insane, and Emma's been going through this phase where she won't sleep through the night, and I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water." "It's okay, sweetheart," I said, relief flooding through me at finally hearing from her directly. "I understand how busy you are. Marcus told me about his conversation with you, about the assisted living options he's been researching. I wanted to talk to you about it myself instead of having him relay everything secondhand." I waited, hoping she'd tell me what she really thought about the idea of me selling the farm and moving to London. "The thing is, Mom," she continued, her voice growing more strained, "I don't know if I'm thinking clearly about any of this anymore. Marcus keeps telling me you're not safe living alone, that something terrible is going to happen if you don't move somewhere with more support. And logically, I know he's probably right. But emotionally, the thought of you selling the farm, selling everything that connects us to Dad and to our family history, it just breaks my heart." I felt tears starting to form in my eyes. "So you don't want me to sell?" There was a long pause. "I don't know what I want," she said finally. "I want you to be safe and happy and healthy. I want Emma to know her grandmother and have a relationship with you that isn't just these rushed video calls. But I also want to respect your independence and your right to make your own decisions about where you live and how you spend your final years." I could hear Emma babbling in the background, and Sarah's voice became more distant as she spoke to her daughter. "Just a minute, sweetheart. Mommy's talking to Grandma." "Mom, are you still there?" she asked, returning her attention to our conversation. "I'm here," I said softly. "Sarah, can I ask you something? Do you really want me to move to London? Or is this Marcus's idea?" Another long pause. "It started as Marcus's idea," she admitted. "He's been worried about liability issues, about what would happen if something happened to you and we weren't there to help. He keeps talking about elder care responsibilities and legal obligations and all these practical concerns that I honestly hadn't thought much about. But the more we've discussed it, the more I've started to see his point. You are getting older, Mom. And while I know you're still healthy and capable, that won't always be the case. Wouldn't it be better to make these decisions while you're still able to choose what you want instead of waiting until circumstances force your hand?" She sounded like she was reciting arguments Marcus had made to her, testing them out in her own voice to see if they felt true. I could tell she was genuinely conflicted, torn between her emotional attachment to our family history and the practical concerns her husband had raised. "What would you want me to do if I was your daughter in this situation?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. I thought about it for a moment, trying to imagine myself in Sarah's position, trying to balance concern for an aging parent with respect for their autonomy and attachment to their home. "I'd want to have an honest conversation about what you were afraid of and what you needed to feel secure about my well-being," I said finally. "I'd want to explore all the options, not just the ones that seemed most convenient from a distance. And I'd want to make sure any decisions we made were based on what was truly best for both of us, not just what solved the most problems in the short term." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "You're right," she said. "We should have had this conversation months ago instead of Marcus and me just deciding what we thought was best for you." "It's not too late," I said gently. "We can have it now." "What are you most afraid of?" she asked. "About getting older? About living alone? About the future?" I considered the question carefully. "I'm not afraid of dying," I said. "I've made my peace with mortality, especially since your father passed. What I'm afraid of is losing myself before I die. Losing my independence, my connection to this place that has shaped who I am, my ability to make meaningful choices about how I spend whatever time I have left. And what would you need to feel secure about my well-being without giving up those things that are important to you?" "I'd need to know that I had reliable ways to get help if I needed it," I said. I'd need to have my legal affairs in order so that my wishes would be respected, even if I became unable to advocate for myself. I'd need to maintain connections with my community and have regular contact with family so that changes in my health or cognitive function would be noticed and addressed promptly. Those all sound reasonable, Sarah said, and they don't necessarily require you to sell the farm and move to another country. No, they don't, I agreed. In fact, I've already started working with Harold Brennan to set up a trust that would protect the farm's future, while ensuring I have the resources I need for my care. You have? Sarah sounded surprised. Marcus didn't mention that. Because I haven't told Marcus about it, I said. This is my decision to make, and while I appreciate his concern, I don't need his permission to consult with my own attorney about my own affairs. There was another pause, and I could hear Emma getting fussier in the background. Sarah, I need to go deal with this meltdown, she said, but I'm glad we talked. I feel like I understand your perspective better now, and I think you're right that we rushed into assuming Marcus's solution was the only option. Can we talk again soon? I asked. Maybe when you have more time and Emma's not competing for your attention? Yes, she said. I'll call you this weekend, and we can really dig into this. Maybe we can find a way for you to stay on the farm while still addressing the safety concerns that have Marcus so worried. After we hung up, I felt better than I had in weeks. Sarah and I had finally had the kind of honest conversation I'd been hoping for, and it was clear that she didn't share Marcus's certainty about what I should do with my future. She was conflicted, concerned about my well-being but respectful of my autonomy. That felt much more like the daughter I'd raised. But when the weekend came, Sarah didn't call. I waited all day Saturday, thinking maybe she'd gotten busy with Emma or caught up in household tasks. Sunday came and went without a call as well. By Monday, I was starting to worry that Marcus had talked her out of our follow-up conversation. I tried calling her Tuesday evening, but the call went straight to voicemail. I left a message reminding her about our planned conversation and asking her to call me back when she had a chance. She didn't return my call that day or the next. On Thursday, I tried again. This time, Marcus answered. Tillie, he said, his voice tight with what sounded like frustration. We need to talk. Is Sarah available? I asked. She promised to call me this weekend to continue our conversation about my future plans. That's what I want to talk to you about, Marcus said. Your conversation with Sarah upset her more than you probably realize. She spent the entire weekend second-guessing decisions we'd already made, questioning whether we were doing the right thing by encouraging you to relocate. I felt a flicker of anger. We weren't questioning anything. We were having the kind of thoughtful discussion that should happen before major life decisions are made. The problem is, Marcus continued, that all this uncertainty is affecting Sarah's performance at work. She's distracted, emotional, unable to focus on her responsibilities. Her supervisor has already commented on the decline in her productivity. This is exactly the kind of stress I was trying to help her avoid by handling the logistics of your relocation myself. Marcus, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, Sarah is an adult who is capable of having difficult conversations with her mother without it derailing her entire career. If she's struggling with work performance, maybe the issue is that she's trying to balance too many responsibilities, not that she's thinking carefully about her family's future. The issue, Marcus shot back, is that you're being selfish. You're prioritizing your sentimental attachment to an old house and some farmland over your daughter's well-being and your granddaughter's need for stability. Sentimental attachment. He said it like my connection to 4 generations of family history was nothing more than foolish nostalgia. This isn't just about sentiment, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. This is about preserving something meaningful for Emma's future, about maintaining our family's roots and identity. This farm has supported our family for over a century. It's not just real estate to be liquidated for convenience. What it is, Marcus said coldly, is a liability that's preventing you from getting the care you need and preventing Sarah from focusing on the life she's building here in London. Your attachment to the past is holding everyone back from moving forward. That's not your decision to make, I said. Actually, it might be, Marcus replied. And something in his tone made my blood run cold. Sarah and I have been consulting with an attorney here about our options if you become unable to make rational decisions about your own care. There are legal mechanisms for family members to intervene when an elderly person's judgment becomes compromised. Are you threatening me? I asked, hardly believing what I was hearing. I'm telling you that we're prepared to do whatever is necessary to ensure your safety and Sarah's peace of mind, Marcus said. The easiest way forward is for you to voluntarily accept our help and relocate to Meadowbrook Manor. The alternative could be much more complicated and unpleasant for everyone involved. The line went dead. I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone, my hands shaking with anger and fear. Marcus had just threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent if I didn't comply with his plans for my future. He was talking about legal mechanisms and family intervention like I was a confused old woman who couldn't be trusted to make her own decisions. I thought about Sarah, about whether she knew what her husband was threatening on her behalf. The daughter I'd raised would never stand for someone manipulating an elderly person through legal intimidation, even if that elderly person was her own mother, and she disagreed with their choices. But the Sarah who had married Marcus, who had moved to London to advance his career, who hadn't called me back after promising to continue our conversation, maybe that Sarah was different from the person I thought I knew. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Marcus's threat, about what it would mean if he followed through on it. I'd heard horror stories about elderly people being declared incompetent by family members who wanted to control their finances or force them into care facilities against their will. I'd always assumed those things happened to people who didn't have good relationships with their families, people who didn't have competent legal representation or strong community ties. I never imagined it could happen to me. The next morning, I called Harold Brennan and explained what Marcus had said. Harold listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Tillie," he said finally, "I need you to understand that what Marcus described is theoretically possible, but it's not nearly as simple as he made it sound. To have someone declared incompetent requires extensive medical evaluation, court proceedings, and clear evidence that the person is unable to make rational decisions about their own welfare. Being stubborn about where you want to live doesn't meet that standard." But he sounded so confident, I said, like he'd already researched exactly how to do it. "He may have researched it," Harold replied. "But research and reality are two different things. The bigger concern is what his threat tells us about his intentions and his character. Someone who would use legal intimidation to manipulate an elderly family member is someone you need to be very careful around. What should I do? First, we need to accelerate the timeline on your trust. I'll prioritize getting those documents finalized so that your wishes regarding the farm are legally protected regardless of what happens with your personal situation. Second, I think you should consider documenting this conversation with Marcus, maybe even recording future conversations if that's legal in your jurisdiction. Can he really try to have me declared incompetent from London? It would be much more difficult for him to initiate those proceedings from another country," Harold said. "But if Sarah were to cooperate with him, if she were to return to the States and petition a court here, that could be more problematic. The key is making sure we have clear evidence of your mental competency and clear documentation of your wishes regarding your care and your property." I spent the weekend thinking about Harold's advice and trying to decide what to do next. Part of me wanted to call Sarah directly and confront her about Marcus's threats. But another part of me was afraid of what I might learn. What if she really had agreed to support legal action against me? What if my own daughter had decided that I was too stubborn and irrational to be trusted with my own decisions? On Monday, I drove to town and bought a small digital recorder. If Marcus was going to continue making threats, I wanted to have evidence of what he was saying. I also stopped by the bank and spoke with the manager about my accounts and what protections were in place to prevent unauthorized access. Tuesday evening, the phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the caller ID, and I let it ring 3 times while I turned on the recorder and positioned it near the phone. "Tillie," Marcus said when I answered, "have you had time to reconsider our conversation from last week?" "I've had time to think about a lot of things," I said carefully, "including the legal threats you made." "I didn't make threats," Marcus replied smoothly. "I shared information about options that are available if your judgment becomes impaired to the point where you can't make safe decisions for yourself. And who gets to decide whether my judgment is impaired? I asked. Medical professionals, Marcus said. Courts. People who are trained to evaluate these situations objectively. People you would hire and pay to reach the conclusions you want them to reach, I said. There was a pause. Tillie, you're being paranoid. No one wants to take away your independence. We just want to make sure you're safe and cared for appropriately. By forcing me to sell my home and move to another country where I'd be completely dependent on you and Sarah for everything? By helping you transition to a living situation that matches your current needs and capabilities, Marcus said. Look, I understand that change is difficult, especially at your age. But the reality is that you can't live alone on that farm forever. At some point, you're going to need more support than you can get in rural Missouri. And you've decided that point is now, I said. I've decided that it's better to make these transitions while you're still healthy enough to adapt, rather than waiting until a crisis forces our hand, Marcus replied. That's not unreasonable. What's unreasonable is making unilateral decisions about my future without consulting me and then threatening legal action if I don't comply, I said. Nobody's making unilateral decisions, Marcus said, his voice taking on that hard edge again. Sarah and I are trying to help you make good choices. If you're not willing to accept our help voluntarily, then yes, we may need to explore other options. Other options, I repeated. Like having me declared incompetent. Like consulting with professionals who can help us determine what level of care you actually need, Marcus said. Look, Tillie, I don't want this to become adversarial. I'm trying to work with you here. But I have responsibilities to Sarah and Emma, and I can't let your stubbornness put them at risk. How does my living on my own farm put Sarah and Emma at risk? I asked. Because Sarah worries about you constantly, Marcus said. Because she feels guilty about living so far away while you're aging alone. Because that stress is affecting her health, and her job performance, and her ability to be fully present for Emma. Your choices don't exist in a vacuum, Tillie. They have consequences for other people. The guilt he was trying to induce was overwhelming. I could picture Sarah lying awake at night worrying about me, distracted at work because she was concerned about my safety, unable to enjoy her time with Emma because she was anxious about her mother living alone on the other side of the world. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe my attachment to the farm was selfish if it was causing my daughter so much distress. Maybe love sometimes meant making sacrifices, even when those sacrifices meant giving up everything that made your life meaningful. But then I thought about the recorder running beside the phone, capturing Marcus's threats and manipulations. I thought about Harold's warning that someone who would use legal intimidation against an elderly family member was someone to be very careful around. I thought about the tone in Marcus's voice when he talked about my stubbornness and my inability to make rational decisions. This wasn't about Sarah's well-being or Emma's future. This was about control. Marcus wanted to control where I lived, how I spent my money, what happened to my property. He wanted to eliminate any complications in his life, and my independence was a complication. I need to talk to Sarah, I said finally. She's not available, Marcus replied quickly. She's dealing with a work crisis that's going to keep her busy for the next several days. Then I'll wait until she is available, I said. Tillie, Marcus said, his voice growing harder. I don't think you understand the urgency of this situation. Meadowbrook Manor needs an answer about the December opening within the next week. If you pass on this opportunity, there won't be another opening for at least 6 months, maybe longer. Then I guess I'll have to take my chances, I said. That would be a mistake, Marcus said coldly. A serious mistake that you may not get the chance to correct. After he hung up, I sat staring at the recorder for a long time. Then I rewound it and played back the conversation. Marcus's threats were clear and unmistakable. His manipulation tactics were obvious. This wasn't a concerned son-in-law trying to help his wife's aging mother. This was someone with his own agenda trying to use intimidation and guilt to get what he wanted. The next morning, I called Harold and played him the recording. When it finished, he was quiet for several minutes. Tillie, he said finally, this changes things significantly. What Marcus is doing could be considered elder abuse under Missouri law. The threats, the intimidation, the attempt to coerce you into making major financial decisions under duress, these are all potentially criminal behaviors. What are my options? I asked. We could file a complaint with Adult Protective Services, Harold said. We could seek a restraining order preventing Marcus from contacting you. We could also accelerate the trust paperwork and add specific provisions protecting you from exactly this kind of coercion. But what about Sarah? I asked. What if she's really as worried about me as Marcus claims? What if removing him from the equation just makes things worse for her? That's a conversation you need to have with your daughter directly, Harold said. But you can't make good decisions about your relationship with Sarah while Marcus is threatening and manipulating you. You need to establish clear boundaries with him before you can figure out what kind of relationship is possible with her. That afternoon, I tried calling Sarah's number again. This time, it rang and rang before going to voicemail. I left a message asking her to call me back as soon as possible, saying that I needed to talk to her about something important regarding Marcus and my living situation. She didn't call back that day. Or the next day. By Friday, I was starting to wonder if Marcus had somehow blocked my number from her phone or convinced her not to take my calls. Saturday morning, I was working in my garden, pulling the last of the winter vegetables before the hard freeze that was forecasted for later in the week. It was peaceful work, meditative, the kind of physical activity that helped me think clearly about complicated problems. I was just coming inside to clean up when I heard a car in the driveway. I looked out the kitchen window and saw a vehicle I didn't recognize, a dark sedan with rental car plates. My heart started racing as I wondered if Marcus had somehow come to Missouri to confront me in person. But when the car door opened, it was Sarah who got out. She looked tired and stressed, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of the polished professional clothes she usually favored. She stood by the car for a moment, looking at the farmhouse like she was seeing it for the first time in years. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. "Sarah," I said, hardly believing she was really there. "What are you doing here?" She walked toward me slowly, her expression uncertain. "I came to talk to you," she said. "In person." Without Marcus managing the conversation or telling me what I should say, I felt a surge of relief so strong it almost knocked me over. This was my daughter, the girl I'd raised to think for herself and stand up for what she believed in. Whatever hold Marcus had on her, it wasn't complete. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let her pass. "I'll put on some coffee." Sarah walked into the kitchen and stood looking around like she was remembering something she'd forgotten. "It looks exactly the same," she said softly. "Some things shouldn't change," I replied, busying myself with the coffee maker to give her time to settle in. She sat down at the kitchen table, in the same chair she'd occupied as a child doing homework while I cooked dinner. For a moment, it was like the years collapsed, and she was 12 years old again, coming home from school with stories about her day and plans for the weekend. "Mom," she said finally, "I need to apologize for a lot of things." I poured coffee into 2 mugs and sat down across from her. "Start wherever you want to start," I said. Sarah wrapped her hands around her mug like she was trying to warm herself. "I should have called you back weeks ago when we had that conversation about your future. I should have followed up on the things we talked about instead of letting Marcus handle everything." "What stopped you?" I asked gently. "Fear," she said simply. "Fear that you were right about him trying to control the situation. Fear that I'd already let him make too many decisions for our family without really thinking them through. Fear that I'd turned into someone you wouldn't recognize or respect." I studied my daughter's face, seeing echoes of the little girl who used to come to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings, trusting that I could make everything better. "You're still my daughter," I said. "You're still the person I raised to be strong and independent and thoughtful. That doesn't change just because you've made some decisions I don't understand." "Marcus doesn't see it that way," Sarah said, her voice getting smaller. "He thinks I'm weak for second-guessing our plans. He thinks I'm being manipulated by you instead of focusing on what's best for our family's future." "And what do you think?" I asked. "I think I've been letting him make decisions for me because it was easier than fighting about every little thing," Sarah said. "When we first got married, it seemed like he was just being helpful, taking care of details I didn't want to deal with. But somewhere along the way, helpful turned into controlling, and I didn't notice when it happened." She paused, staring into her coffee. "Or maybe I noticed but didn't want to admit it, Because that would mean I'd made a mistake marrying him. You don't have to have all the answers right now, I said. But you do have to decide whether you're going to let him make decisions about my future without consulting me. That's why I'm here, Sarah said, looking up at me with tears in her eyes. He told me you were being unreasonable about the assisted living arrangements, that you were refusing to consider what was best for everyone involved. But when I asked to hear your side of the story, he said you were too upset to have a rational conversation. And you believed him? I asked. I wanted to believe him, Sarah said. Because if you were being irrational, then his plan made sense and I didn't have to feel guilty about pressuring you to sell the farm. But something about the way he kept deflecting my questions, the way he wouldn't let me talk to you directly, it started to feel wrong. What finally made you decide to come here? I asked. He told me he'd given you an ultimatum, Sarah said. He said you had 1 week to commit to the Meadowbrook Manor placement, or we'd have to explore other options. When I asked what other options, he started talking about legal guardianship and competency evaluations and all these things that sounded like threats. I reached across the table and took her hand. They were threats, Sarah. He's been threatening me for weeks, trying to scare me into complying with his plans, by suggesting that he could have me declared mentally incompetent if I didn't cooperate. Sarah's face went white. He what? I got up and retrieved the digital recorder from the kitchen counter. I played her the conversation from earlier in the week, watching her expression change from confusion to shock to anger as she listened to Marcus's threats and manipulations. When the recording finished, Sarah sat in silence for a long time. Finally, she looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. Mom, I am so sorry. I had no idea he was talking to you that way. I would never have supported any of this if I'd known what he was really doing. I believe you, I said. But Sarah, you have to understand that this isn't just about the assisted living arrangements. This is about how your husband treats people when he thinks he can get away with it. This is about what kind of man you're married to. Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I know, she said. I've been trying not to see it for a long time, but I can't pretend anymore. The way he talks about you, about this place, about anything that doesn't fit into his vision of how life should be, it's dismissive and cruel. She paused, looking around the kitchen again. I used to love this house so much. I used to dream about bringing my children here to visit their grandmother, showing them the places where I grew up, teaching them about their family history. But Marcus made me feel ashamed of it, like it was something primitive and embarrassing instead of something to be proud of. You don't have to be ashamed of where you come from, I said. And you don't have to let anyone else make you feel that way. I know that now, Sarah said. But I don't know what I'm going to do about it. Marcus is Emma's father. We have a life together in London. I have a job there. Commitments, responsibilities. I can't just walk away from all of that because I finally realized my husband is not the person I thought I married. You don't have to make any dramatic decisions right now, I said. But you do need to establish some boundaries about how he treats your family and what role he gets to play in decisions that affect us. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then looked at me with something that might have been hope in her eyes. Can I stay here tonight? She asked. I haven't slept in this house since before I got married, and I think I need to remember what it feels like to be home. Of course you can stay, I said. Your room is exactly the way you left it. That evening, we cooked dinner together for the first time in years. Sarah told me about her job in London, about Emma's personality and development, about the challenges of raising a child in a foreign country while trying to build a career. I told her about the farm, about the community changes she'd missed, about my plans for the trust that would protect our family's legacy. It felt like having my daughter back. The real Sarah. Not the polished version who had learned to navigate Marcus's expectations and social requirements. The Sarah who used to help me can vegetables from the garden, who knew every corner of the farm, who understood why this place mattered to our family's identity. After dinner, we sat on the front porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the sun set over the fields that had supported 4 generations of our family. Sarah was quiet for a long time, and I could see her processing everything that had happened, everything she'd learned about her husband and her marriage and herself. Mom, she said finally, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Anything, I said. If Marcus wasn't in the picture, If I was making this decision entirely on my own, what would you want me to do about the farm, about your living situation, about Emma's future? I considered the question carefully. I'd want you to make whatever decision felt right to you, based on your own values and priorities, I said. If that meant selling the farm and using the money for Emma's education, I could accept that. If it meant keeping the farm as a family retreat you could visit occasionally, I'd be thrilled. If it meant moving back here and rebuilding the agricultural operation, I'd be over the moon. The point is, it would be your decision, made for your reasons, based on what you thought was best for you and Emma. Not a decision imposed on you by someone else's agenda or someone else's definition of what success should look like. Sarah nodded slowly. I think I need to go back to London and have a very serious conversation with my husband, she said. About boundaries, about respect, about what kind of partnership I actually want to have. That sounds like a good place to start, I said. And Mom? Sarah turned to look at me directly. Whatever happens with my marriage, whatever decisions I make about London and my job and all of that, I don't want you to sell the farm unless that's truly what you want to do. This place is part of who we are, part of Emma's heritage. She should get to decide for herself whether it matters to her, not have that choice taken away before she's old enough to understand what she's losing. I felt tears starting to form in my eyes, but they were good tears, tears of relief and gratitude and love. Thank you, I said. That means more to me than you could possibly know. We stayed up late that night, talking about everything we'd missed sharing over the years of distance and misunderstanding. Sarah told me about the loneliness she'd felt in London, the way Marcus's social circle made her feel inadequate and unsophisticated. I told her about my fears of becoming a burden, my struggle to maintain independence while acknowledging that I was getting older and might need more support in the future. By the time we went to bed, I felt like I had my daughter back. The real relationship we'd had before Marcus's influence drove a wedge between us. It wasn't going to be easy for her to establish boundaries with her husband, or figure out what she wanted her life to look like going forward. But at least now we were on the same side, working together instead of being manipulated into working against each other. The next morning, Sarah's phone started ringing early. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and she stared at it for a long moment before declining the call. It rang again 5 minutes later, then again 10 minutes after that. By the fourth call, Sarah turned the phone off entirely. He's going to be furious that I came here without telling him, she said. Are you afraid of him? I asked. Not physically, Sarah said. But he has ways of making me feel guilty and stupid when I do things he doesn't approve of. He'll tell me I'm being manipulated by you, that I'm jeopardizing Emma's future by getting emotionally involved in decisions that should be made logically. And how does that make you feel? I asked. Like I'm not smart enough or strong enough to make good decisions for myself, Sarah said. Which is exactly how he wants me to feel, isn't it? Probably, I said. It's easier to control someone who doubts their own judgment. Sarah spent 3 more days at the farm. We used the time to work through years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding, to rebuild the trust that had been damaged by distance and Marcus's manipulation. She helped me with some of the heavier farm work, and I could see her remembering why she'd once loved this place so much. On her last morning, she sat at the kitchen table with her phone in her hands, staring at the dozens of missed calls and text messages from Marcus. His messages had started out concerned, then become demanding, then turned angry and accusatory. The most recent ones were threats about what would happen to their marriage if she didn't return immediately and commit to their original plan for my relocation. I have to go back, she said finally. I have to face this and figure out what I'm going to do. I know, I said. But remember that you have options. You're not trapped, no matter how much Marcus might want you to believe you are. What if he won't accept boundaries? Sarah asked. What if he makes it impossible for me to maintain a relationship with you while staying married to him? Then you'll have to decide what's more important to you, I said. Your marriage or your family, your husband's approval or your own integrity. I can't make that choice for you, but I can promise that whatever you decide, I'll support you. Sarah hugged me tight before she left, and I could feel her trembling with anxiety about the confrontation that awaited her in London. But there was also something different about her. Something stronger and more determined than I'd seen in years. Marcus had overplayed his hand by threatening me, and in doing so, he'd awakened something in my daughter that I thought he'd managed to suppress permanently. After she left, I called Harold Brennan and asked him to expedite the trust paperwork. Whatever happened between Sarah and Marcus, I wanted to make sure the farm's future was legally protected. I also asked him to research what legal protections were available to me if Marcus followed through on his threats about competency evaluations and guardianship proceedings. Harold assured me that Marcus would have a very difficult time initiating any legal action against me from London, especially now that we had recorded evidence of his threats and coercion. But he also advised me to document everything, to maintain regular contact with my doctor to establish my mental competency, and to be prepared for the possibility that this situation might get worse before it got better. A week later, Sarah called me. Her voice was strained but determined when she told me about her conversation with Marcus. He'd been furious about her trip to Missouri, accusing her of betraying their family's interests and jeopardizing Emma's future. When she'd tried to establish boundaries about his treatment of me, he'd dismissed her concerns and insisted that his approach was the only practical solution to the problem of my aging. The conversation had escalated into a major fight, with Marcus ultimately giving Sarah an ultimatum. Either she supported his plan to force my relocation to London, or their marriage was over. He wasn't willing to compromise, wasn't willing to consider alternative approaches, wasn't willing to respect her right to maintain a relationship with her mother on her own terms. I told him I needed time to think about it, Sarah said. But honestly, Mom, I think our marriage has been over for a while. I just haven't been willing to admit it to myself. What are you going to do? I asked. I'm going to start making plans to come home, Sarah said. Not immediately, but soon. I need to figure out the logistics of relocating with Emma, of finding a job, of rebuilding a life that's based on my values instead of his expectations. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but I tried to keep my voice neutral. Are you sure that's what you want? I asked. It's a big decision, and once you make it, it will be difficult to undo. I'm sure, Sarah said. I want Emma to grow up, knowing her grandmother, knowing where she comes from, understanding that there are different ways to live a meaningful life. I want her to have roots, not just ambition. I want her to see that women can be strong and independent and make their own choices, even when those choices are difficult. Over the following weeks, Sarah began the complicated process of extricating herself from her life in London. She consulted with attorneys about custody arrangements, spoke with her employer about the possibility of working remotely, researched schools in Missouri where Emma could eventually enroll. Marcus fought her every step of the way, using Emma as leverage to try to force Sarah to change her mind. He threatened to seek full custody, to claim that Sarah was having some kind of breakdown that made her an unfit mother. He tried to freeze their joint accounts, to prevent her from accessing the resources she'd need to relocate. But Sarah had learned from watching what he'd tried to do to me. She documented everything, recorded conversations, worked with her own attorney to protect her interests and Emma's future. She was no longer the uncertain young woman who would let her husband make all the important decisions. She'd found her strength again, and she was using it to reclaim her life. The day Sarah and Emma finally came home to Missouri was one of the happiest days of my life. Emma was almost 3 years old by then, a bright, curious little girl with her mother's eyes and her grandfather's stubborn streak. But within hours, she was toddling around the farmhouse like she owned the place, exploring every room with the fearless curiosity that reminded me so much of Sarah at that age. She was fascinated by the chickens in the coop, delighted by the barn cats who came running when they heard the feed bucket rattle, amazed by the vastness of fields that stretched beyond the horizon. Sarah had rented a small house in town temporarily while she figured out longer-term arrangements, but she and Emma spent most of their days at the farm. It was like having my family back after years of emptiness, watching 3 generations of Anderson women working together in the kitchen, teaching Emma the same songs and stories that had been passed down through our family for decades. Marcus called constantly during those first few weeks, alternating between rage and manipulation, as he tried to convince Sarah to return to London. Sometimes he'd be furious, screaming about custody battles and financial ruin, and the destruction of Emma's future opportunities. Other times he'd be sweet and apologetic, promising to change, to be more respectful of Sarah's relationship with me, to find compromises that would work for everyone. But Sarah had heard it all before. She'd lived through his cycles of anger and charm for years, and she'd finally learned not to trust his promises of change. She listened to his calls when Emma was present, keeping her voice calm and neutral for her daughter's sake, but she never wavered in her decision to build a new life in Missouri. The legal battles were complicated and expensive. Marcus hired aggressive attorneys who painted Sarah as an unstable woman having a midlife crisis, someone who was endangering her child's welfare by removing her from the sophisticated educational and cultural opportunities available in London. They argued that Emma's best interests lay in maintaining her life in England, with Marcus as her primary caretaker and Sarah relegated to supervised visitation rights. Sarah's attorney countered by presenting evidence of Marcus's controlling behavior, his threats against me, his pattern of using intimidation and manipulation to get his way. The recorded conversations I'd made proved crucial in demonstrating his character and his willingness to abuse elderly family members to achieve his goals. The custody case dragged on for months, with depositions and psychological evaluations and expert witnesses testifying about what constituted Emma's best interests. Marcus flew to Missouri several times, staying in expensive hotels and making a show of his wealth and sophistication for the court proceedings. He presented himself as the responsible parent, the one with stable income and international opportunities, while portraying Sarah as impulsive and emotional. But the judge wasn't impressed by Marcus's polished presentation. She was more interested in the evidence of his behavior, the recordings of his threats, the pattern of control and manipulation that had characterized his relationships with both Sarah and me. She was also interested in Sarah's demonstrated commitment to co-parenting, her willingness to facilitate Emma's relationship with her father despite the difficulties in their marriage. The final custody arrangement wasn't everything Sarah had hoped for, but it was fair. Emma would live primarily in Missouri with Sarah, attending school and building her life in the community where her mother had grown up. Marcus would have extensive visitation rights, including several weeks each summer and alternating holidays, but he couldn't unilaterally relocate Emma back to London without Sarah's consent. The financial settlement was more complicated. Marcus had been the primary breadwinner during their marriage, and he'd used his control over their finances as another tool of manipulation. Sarah was entitled to spousal support and a share of their assets, but accessing those resources required ongoing legal battles that were emotionally draining and financially expensive. That's when I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I told Sarah that I wanted to add her name to the farm's deed, making her a co-owner of the property immediately rather than waiting for her to inherit it after my death. I also established a trust fund for Emma's education and future needs, using money I'd been saving for decades. Harold Brennan advised against it. He worried that I was making emotional decisions that could leave me financially vulnerable in my old age. What if Sarah decided to sell the farm anyway? What if she needed money for legal fees or living expenses and chose to liquidate the property? What if our relationship deteriorated again and I found myself homeless on my own land? But I trusted my daughter in a way I hadn't been able to trust her when Marcus was influencing her decisions. The woman who had stood up to her husband's threats, who had sacrificed financial security to protect her relationship with me, who had fought for months to bring Emma home to her roots, that woman wouldn't betray the legacy we were building together. The paperwork was completed on a crisp October morning, with both Sarah and Emma present in Harold's office. Emma was fascinated by the legal proceedings, asking questions about why grown-ups needed so many papers and what it meant to own land. Sarah explained that it meant the farm would always be part of our family, something that connected us to all the people who had lived there before us, and all the people who might live there in the future. After we left Harold's office, we drove out to the cemetery, where Robert was buried. I hadn't visited his grave in months, but I felt like he needed to know what we'd accomplished, how we'd protected the legacy he'd helped build. Sarah knelt beside his headstone with Emma, telling her grandfather about their new life, about the house they were planning to build on the back section of the farm, about the vegetable garden they were going to plant in the spring. Emma placed a handful of wildflowers on Robert's grave, then looked up at me with serious eyes. "Is Grandpa happy we came home?" she asked. "I think he's very happy," I told her, and I meant it. Robert had always worried about what would happen to the farm after we were gone. He'd wanted it to stay in the family, to continue supporting Anderson children and grandchildren for generations to come. Seeing Sarah and Emma planning their future on this land, talking about the improvements they wanted to make, and the traditions they wanted to continue. I knew we'd honored his wishes. But our peaceful rebuilding period didn't last long. Just as we were settling into our new routines, just as Emma was starting to feel secure in her American life, Marcus began a new campaign of harassment and intimidation. It started with phone calls at all hours, sometimes drunk and angry, sometimes coldly threatening. He'd call in the middle of the night, waking Emma and frightening her with his raised voice carrying through the thin walls of their rental house. He'd call during Emma's nap time, during dinner, during the quiet moments when Sarah was trying to establish stability and routine in their new life. Then came the surprise visits. Marcus would fly to Missouri without warning, appearing at Emma's daycare or at the farm, demanding his visitation rights and creating scenes that embarrassed Sarah and confused Emma. He'd rent luxury cars and expensive hotel suites, making a show of his wealth while criticizing everything about our rural lifestyle. During one particularly ugly confrontation, Marcus showed up at the farm while Sarah was in town running errands. I was alone with Emma, who was napping in the living room, when I heard his BMW crunching up the gravel driveway. My heart started racing as I remembered his threats from months earlier, his suggestions that I was mentally incompetent and needed to be removed from Emma's life. I called Sarah immediately, but the call went to voicemail. Then I called Harold Brennan, but he was in court and couldn't be reached. By the time Marcus was pounding on the front door, I was holding Emma, who had woken up crying from her nap, and trying to figure out what to do. Marcus didn't wait for me to answer the door. He used the spare key Sarah had given him during one of his previous visits, letting himself into my house like he owned the place. Emma saw him and ran to him immediately, calling, "Daddy!" with the uncomplicated joy that children feel when they see their parents. But Marcus's attention wasn't focused on Emma. He was looking around the farmhouse with the same disgusted expression he'd worn during his first visit years earlier, taking inventory of everything he found lacking or inadequate. "This is where you're raising my daughter?" he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "In this museum of rural poverty?" "This is Emma's home," I said quietly, trying not to let my fears show in front of my granddaughter. "This is where her family has lived for 4 generations," Marcus snorted. "Family? You mean the family that's been too backward to progress beyond subsistence farming for over a century? The family that Sarah had to escape to make something of herself?" Emma was watching our exchange with confused eyes, sensing the tension even if she couldn't understand the words. I could see her beginning to withdraw, to become quiet and clingy in the way children do when adults around them are upset. "Marcus," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "Emma doesn't need to hear this kind of conversation. Why don't we go outside and talk while she plays?" "What Emma needs," Marcus said, stepping closer to me in a way that felt threatening, "is to be removed from this environment before it damages her permanently. Do you have any idea what kind of opportunities she's missing by living in this backwater? What kind of education she could be getting in London instead of some rural Missouri school district that probably can't even afford decent textbooks?" He was doing it again, using Emma's welfare as justification for his own agenda, trying to make me feel guilty for wanting to be part of my granddaughter's life. But this time, I wasn't going to be intimidated. "Emma is thriving here," I said firmly. "She's learning about her heritage, developing a connection to the land, building relationships with her extended community. She's happy and healthy and loved." "She's being held back," Marcus snapped, limited by small-town thinking and rural ignorance. "Sarah thinks she's doing Emma a favor by bringing her here, but she's actually damaging her future prospects." That's when Sarah's car pulled into the driveway. I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost knocked me over. Marcus heard the car too, and his expression shifted immediately from threatening to charming, like someone had flipped a switch. Sarah walked through the front door and stopped dead when she saw Marcus standing in my living room. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I came to see my daughter," Marcus said smoothly. "I have visitation rights, remember? I don't need permission to spend time with Emma. You need to coordinate with me," Sarah said. "You can't just show up whenever you feel like it and expect everyone to accommodate your schedule." "I tried calling," Marcus lied easily. "Your phone went straight to voicemail. I was worried something had happened. Sarah pulled out her phone and checked her call log. There were no missed calls from Marcus. She looked at him with the expression of someone who had caught a person in an obvious lie and was deciding whether to call them on it. Emma, meanwhile, was growing more agitated by the tension in the room. She'd started crying, the overwhelming kind of tears that toddlers cry when they're confused and scared and don't understand why the adults around them are upset. "Look what you've done," Marcus said, pointing at Emma's distress like it was proof of his argument. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. This environment is toxic for her. She needs stability, predictability, not this constant drama." "The only drama here is what you're creating," Sarah said, scooping Emma into her arms and trying to comfort her. "Emma's crying because you're shouting and making everyone upset, not because there's anything wrong with her life here." Marcus's mask of charm slipped again, revealing the angry, controlling man underneath. "You're deluding yourself if you think this is what's best for her," he said. "Emma deserves better than this rural backwater. She deserves the opportunities I can provide." "What Emma deserves," Sarah said quietly, "is parents who put her needs ahead of their own egos. Parents who can have a civilized conversation without frightening her. Parents who respect each other enough to work together for her benefit." "Don't lecture me about parenting," Marcus snarled. "I'm not the one who dragged my child away from everything she knew because I was having some kind of midlife crisis about wanting to play farmer. And I'm not the one who threatens elderly family members or shows up uninvited to create confrontations in front of a 3-year-old, Sarah shot back. The argument escalated from there, with Marcus becoming increasingly aggressive and Sarah becoming more defensive. Emma's crying grew louder, and I could see that the situation was spiraling out of control in a way that was going to be damaging for everyone involved. That's when I made a decision that surprised even me. I stepped between Sarah and Marcus, positioning myself so that I was facing him directly, and I spoke in the firm, no-nonsense voice I'd used when Sarah was a teenager testing boundaries. "Marcus," I said, "you need to leave. Right now." He stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," I said. "This is my house, and I'm telling you to leave. You're frightening Emma, you're upsetting Sarah, and you're not welcome here when you can't behave respectfully." "You don't get to tell me when I can see my daughter," Marcus said, his voice rising dangerously. "I'm not telling you when you can see Emma," I said. "I'm telling you that you can't see her here, in my house, when you're acting like this. If you want to spend time with your daughter, you can make arrangements with Sarah to meet somewhere else, at a time when you can control your temper and treat people with basic decency." Marcus looked shocked that I was standing up to him. He'd gotten used to intimidating me over the phone, to making me feel small and helpless with his threats and legal jargon. But this was my house, my land, my family, and I wasn't going to let him terrorize a 3-year-old because he was angry about losing control over his wife. "Fine," he said finally, his voice cold and sharp. "But this isn't over, Tillie. Not by a long shot." After he left, Sarah and I sat in the kitchen, trying to calm Emma down and process what had just happened. Emma had stopped crying, but she was clingy and quiet, the way children get when they've been exposed to adult conflict they don't understand. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that," Sarah said, rubbing Emma's back as she dozed fitfully in her mother's lap. "I had no idea he was planning to show up today." "It's not your fault," I said. "But we need to think about how to handle this going forward. He's escalating, becoming more aggressive and unpredictable." Sarah nodded grimly. "I think we need to go back to court and ask for supervised visitation. This pattern of showing up unannounced and creating confrontations isn't good for Emma, and it's not sustainable for any of us." The legal process of modifying Marcus's visitation rights was slow and expensive, but we had plenty of evidence to support our case. The surprise visits, the aggressive behavior, the way he used Emma's presence as a shield while he verbally attacked Sarah and me, all of it painted a picture of someone who was more interested in maintaining control than in genuinely co-parenting his daughter. During this period, Marcus's harassment intensified. He hired a private investigator to document our daily routines. looking for evidence of negligence or inappropriate behavior that he could use in court. The investigator would sit in a car at the end of our driveway, taking pictures of Emma playing in the yard, of Sarah working in the garden, of me doing routine farm chores. Marcus also began a campaign of character assassination in the community, spreading rumors about Sarah's mental stability and my fitness as a caregiver. He told anyone who would listen that Sarah had abandoned a successful career and a stable marriage to pursue some fantasy about rural life, that she was using Emma as a pawn in her revenge against him, that I was a manipulative old woman who was poisoning his daughter against him. Most people in our small community saw through Marcus's lies, but the constant scrutiny and gossip were exhausting. Sarah found herself having to defend her choices and her parenting to virtual strangers, explaining over and over why she'd left London, why she'd brought Emma back to Missouri, why she thought rural life was beneficial for her daughter. Emma, meanwhile, was struggling with the instability and conflict surrounding her father's visits. She'd become anxious and withdrawn, afraid to play outside because of the man with the camera, confused about why Daddy was angry all the time, worried that she'd done something wrong to cause all the grown-up fighting. Sarah made the difficult decision to seek counseling for Emma, working with a child psychologist who specialized in helping kids navigate divorce and custody conflicts. The therapist confirmed what we'd all observed. Emma was being damaged by her father's aggressive behavior and needed protection from his emotional volatility. The therapist's report became crucial evidence in our court case. She documented Emma's anxiety symptoms, her regression in potty training and sleep patterns, her fearful responses to unexpected visitors or loud voices. She recommended that Marcus's visitation be supervised by a neutral third party until he could demonstrate that he could prioritize Emma's emotional well-being over his own anger. Marcus fought the supervised visitation order viciously, spending tens of thousands of dollars on attorneys who argued that Sarah and I were alienating Emma from her father, that we were creating a hostile environment that made normal co-parenting impossible. His lawyers presented him as the victim of a vindictive ex-wife and a manipulative mother-in-law who were using his daughter to punish him for being successful. But the evidence was overwhelming. The judge had recordings of Marcus's threats against me, documentation of his surprise visits, and aggressive confrontations, expert testimony about the impact of his behavior on Emma's emotional development. She ruled that supervised visitation was necessary to protect Emma's best interests and ordered Marcus to complete anger management counseling before his restrictions could be lifted. Marcus's reaction to the court order was explosive. He called Sarah's attorney and screamed about bias and corruption, threatening to file appeals and complaints with every authority he could think of. He called me at home and left voicemails that were so threatening Harold Brennan advised me to save them as evidence for a potential restraining order. But the most disturbing escalation came when Marcus hired what he called a family reunification specialist, essentially a kidnapping expert who specialized in helping non-custodial parents relocate their children to other countries. This person began showing up at Emma's daycare, asking questions about security procedures, photographing the building layout, gathering intelligence about Emma's daily routines. The daycare director called Sarah immediately when she noticed the suspicious behavior. Sarah contacted the police, who confirmed that Marcus had hired someone to conduct surveillance on Emma with the likely goal of planning an abduction. The specialist had a history of helping wealthy parents circumvent custody orders by relocating children to countries that didn't recognize American court decisions. That was the final straw. Sarah filed for a restraining order that would prevent Marcus from coming within 500 feet of Emma, her school, our farm, or any of our usual haunts. She also requested that his passport be flagged to prevent him from leaving the country with Emma, and that his visitation rights be suspended entirely pending a comprehensive psychological evaluation. The restraining order hearing was the most emotionally difficult day of the entire legal process. Marcus showed up with an expensive suit and a team of attorneys, presenting himself as a loving father being persecuted by an unstable ex-wife and her vindictive family. He testified about his love for Emma, his commitment to co-parenting, his devastation at being separated from his daughter by Sarah's unreasonable demands. But when Sarah's attorney played the recordings of Marcus's threats against me, when the daycare director testified about the suspicious surveillance of Emma's school, when the child psychologist explained the damage being done to Emma's emotional development, Marcus's carefully constructed image began to crumble. The judge granted the restraining order and suspended Marcus's visitation rights indefinitely. She ruled that his behavior demonstrated a pattern of escalating aggression and potential danger to both Emma's physical and emotional well-being. Before any future contact could be considered, he would need to complete extensive counseling and demonstrate genuine changes in his behavior patterns. Marcus left the courthouse in a rage, shouting threats about appeals and higher courts and justice denied. But his legal options were limited. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his pattern of escalating behavior had created a clear record of why the court's restrictions were necessary. For the first time in months, Sarah and Emma could relax. There were no more surprise visits, no more threatening phone calls, no more surveillance and harassment. Emma's anxiety began to improve, and she started sleeping through the night again. Sarah was able to focus on building their new life, instead of constantly defending against Marcus's attacks. We celebrated Emma's 4th birthday with a big party on the farm, inviting all the friends she'd made in daycare and preschool, along with neighbors and church members who had become part of our extended family. Emma ran around the yard in her party dress, showing off the chickens and the barn cats to her friends, completely secure in her environment, for the first time since moving back to Missouri. But even as we were building this new life together, I knew that Marcus wasn't done with us. Men like him don't give up when they lose in court. They find other ways to exert control, other methods of punishment and revenge. I just didn't expect his next move to be quite so devastating. It started with what seemed like routine business correspondence. A certified letter arrived addressed to me personally, from a law firm I'd never heard of, regarding what they called outstanding obligations related to my property. I assumed it was some kind of scam or mistake and set it aside to deal with later. But then, more letters started arriving. Official-looking documents with legal letterhead, references to liens and judgments and collection proceedings. I finally took them to Harold Brennan, who examined them with growing alarm. "Tillie," he said after reviewing the paperwork, "someone has been very busy. And very creative." "What do you mean?" I asked. "These documents appear to show that you owe significant money to several different creditors," Harold explained. "There are judgments for unpaid loans, liens against your property for services allegedly rendered, collection actions for credit cards, and medical bills that total well into 6 figures. But I don't owe any of this money," I protested. "I don't even recognize most of these companies." "I know," Harold said grimly. "Someone has been using your personal information to create fraudulent debts, and then pursuing legal collection actions against your property. It's identity theft on a massive scale, designed specifically to force you into bankruptcy and potentially lose the farm." The scope of the fraud was breathtaking. Somehow, someone had obtained my social security number, my mother's maiden name, my banking information, and other personal details needed to open credit accounts in my name. They'd systematically created dozens of fraudulent debts over a period of several months, then filed collection lawsuits in different jurisdictions where I was unlikely to receive proper notice of the legal proceedings. By the time I discovered what was happening, there were already multiple judgments against me, liens filed against the farm, and collection agencies demanding immediate payment of debts I'd never incurred. The total amount claimed was over $300,000, more than enough to force me into bankruptcy and potentially result in the loss of the farm. Harold immediately began the process of challenging the fraudulent debts, filing complaints with law enforcement and credit agencies, working to get the liens removed from my property. But the legal process was slow and expensive, and every day that passed brought new collection demands and threats of foreclosure. Sarah was devastated when she learned what was happening. She blamed herself for bringing Marcus's wrath down on our family, for not anticipating that he would retaliate against the court orders by targeting me financially. She offered to use her divorce settlement money to pay off the fraudulent debts, but Harold advised against it, explaining that paying fraudulent debts could be seen as acknowledgement of their validity. Instead, we had to fight each fraudulent claim individually, proving that I had never applied for the credit, never received the goods or services allegedly provided, never signed the documents that supposedly created the debts. It was a time-consuming and emotionally draining process that required me to document every aspect of my financial life for the past several years. During this period, I started receiving strange phone calls from people claiming to be process servers, debt collectors, and court officials. They would demand immediate payment of the fraudulent debts, threaten me with arrest or property seizure, and use intimidation tactics designed to frighten elderly people into paying money they didn't actually owe. I quickly learned to recognize these scam calls and hang up immediately, but the constant harassment was wearing me down. I was 73 years old, dealing with complex legal proceedings while trying to help Sarah establish her new life and care for Emma. The stress was affecting my health, my sleep, my ability to enjoy the simple activities that had always brought me peace. One particularly bad week, I received 17 different collection calls, 3 fake legal documents demanding immediate payment, and a notice that someone claiming to be me had applied for a second mortgage on the farm. I broke down crying in Harold's office, overwhelmed by the feeling that no matter how hard we fought, Marcus would find new ways to destroy our family's security. That's when Harold suggested we hire a private investigator to trace the source of the identity theft. The investigator was expensive, but she was also thorough and experienced in financial fraud cases. Within 2 weeks, she had traced the fraudulent accounts back to their source. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. The fraudulent accounts had been opened using personal information that only a few people had access to, including details from my medical records and financial documents that Marcus could have obtained during his visits to Missouri. The timing of the account openings coincided with the court proceedings that had resulted in his restraining order and loss of visitation rights. Most damning was the pattern of the fraud itself. The accounts were opened systematically, designed to create the maximum legal complexity and financial damage. This wasn't random identity theft by strangers looking for quick cash. This was a coordinated attack designed specifically to force me into bankruptcy and potentially cost me the farm. Harold used this evidence to file a complaint with federal authorities, alleging that Marcus had orchestrated the identity theft as retaliation for the custody case. He also filed motions in court arguing that the fraudulent debts were part of a broader pattern of harassment and abuse, requesting that all collection actions be stayed pending the resolution of the criminal investigation. The federal investigation moved slowly, but it was thorough. Financial crimes investigators examined the paper trail, interviewed witnesses, and built a comprehensive case against Marcus and potentially others who had helped him orchestrate the fraud. They discovered that he had hired a company that specialized in what they euphemistically called reputation management and debt recovery services. This company had a history of creating elaborate fraudulent debt schemes for wealthy clients who wanted to financially destroy business rivals, ex-spouses, or family members they were in conflict with. They were experts at manipulating the credit and legal systems to create financial chaos that was difficult to unravel and expensive to fight. The investigation took almost a year to complete, during which time Harold and I continued to fight the fraudulent debts in various courts, while Sarah tried to shield Emma from the stress and uncertainty surrounding our legal battles. Emma was thriving in her new environment, making friends at preschool, learning to help with simple farm chores, developing the kind of connection to the land that Sarah had once had. But the financial pressure was enormous. Even though the debts were fraudulent, fighting them required expensive legal representation and consumed countless hours of time and energy. Harold's fees alone were approaching $50,000, money I could ill afford on my fixed income. Sarah insisted on contributing to the legal costs, using money from her divorce settlement and her new job at a marketing firm in the nearest city. But I could see the strain it was putting on her finances and her ability to provide for Emma's needs. She was working long hours and commuting over an hour each way, trying to rebuild her career while managing the demands of single motherhood and our ongoing legal crisis. I started to wonder if Marcus had been right about one thing. Maybe my stubborn attachment to the farm was causing more problems than it was solving. Maybe Sarah and Emma would be better off if I just gave up the fight, sold the property, and used whatever remained after paying off the fraudulent debts to start over somewhere else. But every time I considered surrender, I would walk out to Robert's grave and remember why this place mattered so much. This wasn't just land or a house or an agricultural operation. This was 4 generations of Anderson family history, the foundation of our identity, the legacy I wanted to leave for Emma and her children. More importantly, giving up would mean letting Marcus win. It would prove that wealthy, powerful people could destroy the lives of ordinary families through manipulation and fraud, that there was no justice for people who couldn't afford to fight back indefinitely. The break in our case came when the federal investigators arrested the owner of the reputation management company Marcus had hired. Faced with serious federal charges and the prospect of decades in prison, he agreed to cooperate with the investigation and provide evidence against his clients, including Marcus. The evidence was devastating. Recorded phone conversations showed Marcus explicitly directing the creation of fraudulent debts against me, discussing strategies for maximizing the legal complexity and financial damage, celebrating when new liens were filed against the farm. There were also emails detailing his broader plan to destroy our family financially as punishment for Sarah's decision to leave him and seek custody of Emma. Harold called me on a Wednesday morning in February to tell me that federal prosecutors were prepared to file criminal charges against Marcus for identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy. They were also prepared to assist in getting all the fraudulent debts dismissed and the liens removed from my property. I felt a surge of relief so strong it made me dizzy. After more than a year of fighting, of watching our savings drain away on legal fees, of wondering if we'd lose everything Robert and I had worked for, justice was finally within reach. The criminal charges against Marcus were filed in federal court, where he couldn't hide behind expensive attorneys or his wealthy connections. The case was solid, backed by recorded conversations, financial records, and the testimony of his co-conspirators. His reputation as a successful international businessman was destroyed overnight when news of his arrest appeared in financial publications and London newspapers. More importantly for our family, the civil courts began dismissing the fraudulent debts and removing the liens from my property. The process wasn't immediate, but it was systematic and comprehensive. Within 6 months, every fraudulent claim against me had been dismissed, and my credit report had been cleared of all the false entries. Marcus's attempts to destroy us financially had failed completely. In fact, his criminal behavior had made our legal position stronger than ever. Harold was able to use the evidence of Marcus's fraud to get a permanent restraining order that would prevent him from ever contacting any member of our family again. Sarah was granted sole custody of Emma, with no possibility of future visitation for Marcus. We also had grounds for a massive civil lawsuit against Marcus for the financial and emotional damage his fraud had caused our family. Harold estimated that we could potentially recover hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages, plus attorney fees and punitive damages designed to discourage similar behavior in the future. But Sarah surprised me by saying she didn't want to pursue the civil case. She was exhausted by 2 years of legal battles and wanted to focus on building a positive future for Emma, rather than continuing to fight about the past. She also worried that a prolonged civil case would keep Marcus as a presence in our lives, even if only through legal proceedings. I understood her reasoning, but part of me wanted to make Marcus pay for what he'd done to our family. He'd tried to destroy us financially, to steal our home, to tear apart the relationships that mattered most to us. Shouldn't there be consequences for that kind of deliberate cruelty? In the end, we compromised. Harold negotiated a settlement agreement where Marcus would pay a significant sum to cover our legal expenses and compensate us for the damage he'd caused, in exchange for our agreement not to pursue additional civil claims. The amount was substantial enough to secure Emma's college education and provide a financial cushion for our family's future. More importantly, the settlement included ironclad provisions preventing Marcus from ever contacting any member of our family again, directly or indirectly. He was prohibited from coming to Missouri, from hiring investigators to surveil us, from creating any kind of social media or online presence that referenced our family. Any violation of these terms would result in immediate financial penalties and potential criminal charges. The final court hearing to approve the settlement was held on a beautiful spring morning in May. Sarah, Emma, and I sat together in the courtroom, listening as the judge reviewed the terms of the agreement and formally dismissed all the fraudulent cases that had been filed against me. When it was over, when the last legal document had been signed and filed, we walked out of the courthouse into the sunshine of a new beginning. Emma ran ahead of us toward the car, her pigtails bouncing as she chattered about the ice cream Sarah had promised her after the boring grown-up meeting was finished. As I watched my granddaughter playing in the courthouse parking lot, completely carefree and secure in her world, I realized that we had won more than just a legal victory. We had protected our family's integrity, preserved our legacy for future generations, and proven that love and determination could triumph over wealth and manipulation. The farm was secure, legally protected by the trust arrangements Harold had established. Sarah and Emma had a stable home base where they could build their new life together. And Marcus was permanently removed from our lives, unable to threaten or manipulate any of us ever again. But the most important victory was seeing Sarah strong and independent again, making her own decisions based on her own values, raising Emma with the confidence that comes from knowing she was surrounded by people who truly loved her. That was worth more than any amount of money or property. That evening we had a celebration dinner on the farm. Sarah cooked Robert's favorite meal, and we ate it at the kitchen table where 4 generations of Anderson families had shared their meals and their dreams. Emma helped me feed the chickens afterward, laughing as they competed for the scattered corn, completely at home in the environment her great-grandfather had built with his own hands. As the sun set over the fields that had supported our family for over a century, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction and gratitude. We had faced the worst that Marcus could throw at us, and we had not only survived but emerged stronger than ever. The farm was secure, our family was united, and Emma would grow up knowing where she came from and what she was worth. The battle was over, but the real victory was just beginning. 2 years later, I was standing in the doorway of what used to be the old barn, watching Emma chase butterflies through the wildflower meadow we'd planted where the corn used to grow. At 5 years old, she moved through this landscape like she'd been born to it, which in many ways, she had been. Her laughter carried across the fields, mixing with the sound of Sarah's voice calling from the garden where she was harvesting tomatoes for the farmer's market. The transformation of our lives had been gradual but profound. Sarah had found her footing in the marketing world, working remotely for a sustainable agriculture company that appreciated her unique combination of urban sophistication and rural authenticity. She'd built a client base of small farms and artisanal food producers who valued her understanding of both traditional farming methods and modern digital marketing strategies. Emma had thrived in ways that surprised even me. The little girl who had arrived from London shy and uncertain had blossomed into a confident, curious child who could identify dozens of plants and animals, who helped tend the vegetable garden with the seriousness of someone who understood where food actually came from, who fell asleep each night to the sound of crickets and owls instead of traffic and sirens. We'd made changes to the farm operation over the past 2 years, modernizing some aspects while preserving the essential character that had made this place special for 4 generations. The old dairy barn had been converted into a farm store where we sold vegetables, eggs, honey, and handmade crafts to tourists and locals alike. Sarah had developed an online presence for our products, shipping specialty items like my grandmother's pickles and preserves to customers across the country. But the most significant change had been the addition of the guest cottage Sarah and Emma had built on the back section of the property. It was a small, efficient home that captured the farmhouse aesthetic while incorporating all the modern conveniences that made daily life easier. Sarah had designed it herself, working with local contractors who understood both her vision and the practical requirements of rural living. The cottage gave them independence while keeping them close enough that Emma could run between the 2 houses freely, treating the entire farm as her domain. She had chores in both locations, feeding chickens at my house in the morning and helping Sarah tend the herb garden at their cottage in the evening. She was learning responsibility and work ethic in the natural way that rural children always had, through daily participation in the activities that sustained their family. Marcus had become nothing more than a distant memory, his threats and manipulations relegated to the past where they belonged. The federal conviction had resulted in a 2-year prison sentence, followed by 5 years of probation during which he was prohibited from leaving the country or contacting any member of our family. His career in international finance had been destroyed, his reputation ruined, his ability to harm us permanently eliminated. Emma occasionally asked about her father, usually prompted by seeing other children with their dads at school events or community gatherings. Sarah handled these questions with honesty appropriate to Emma's age, explaining that some parents weren't able to be good parents, that Emma was loved and safe with the family she had, that not all families looked the same but all families needed love and respect to function properly. Emma seemed to accept these explanations without significant distress. Her world was full of loving adults who invested in her development and well-being. She had her mother, who was present and engaged in every aspect of her daily life. She had me as a grandmother who could share stories and traditions and unconditional love. She had neighbors and teachers and community members who watched out for her and celebrated her achievements. Most importantly, she had roots. She knew where she came from, understood the history of the land she lived on, could recite the stories of her great-great-grandfather who had first settled this farm over a century ago. She was growing up with a sense of continuity and belonging that many children never experience, especially in our increasingly mobile and disconnected society. The legal and financial battles had left us stronger rather than weaker. The settlement from Marcus had provided security for Emma's future education and our family's long-term stability. More importantly, the experience of fighting for our values and our independence had proven that we could weather any storm as long as we stood together. Harold Brennan had become more than just our attorney over the years. He'd become a trusted friend and advisor who helped us navigate not just legal challenges but also the practical decisions involved in managing a multi-generational farm operation. He'd helped us establish Emma's college fund, structure Sarah's business as a proper LLC, and plan for the eventual transition of farm ownership to the next generation. The trust arrangements we'd established had proven their worth during the fraud crisis, protecting our property from Marcus's attempts to force us into bankruptcy. Now they served as a foundation for long-term planning, ensuring that the farm would remain in our family for Emma's children and grandchildren, while providing flexibility for each generation to adapt the operation to changing circumstances and opportunities. Sarah had surprised me by embracing not just rural life but agricultural innovation. She'd researched sustainable farming practices, experimented with heirloom varieties of vegetables and herbs, developed partnerships with restaurants and farmers markets that valued locally grown, organically produced food. She was building on the foundation her grandfather and I had established while taking the operation in directions we never could have imagined. The farm store had become a gathering place for the community, hosting workshops on canning and preserving, offering cooking classes that taught people how to prepare fresh, seasonal meals, providing a venue for local artisans to sell their handmade goods. Sarah had transformed what had been primarily a production-focused operation into something that served educational and social functions as well. Emma was learning business skills alongside farming knowledge, helping to weigh vegetables for customers, counting change, explaining to visitors how the chickens were raised, and why the eggs tasted different from store-bought varieties. She was developing confidence and communication skills that would serve her well regardless of what career path she eventually chose. But more than specific skills, Emma was learning values. She understood the connection between hard work and reward, between caring for animals and the land and the food that sustained human life. She was developing empathy for living things and respect for the natural world that had been lost by too many children, raised in urban environments, disconnected from the sources of their sustenance. On quiet evenings when the three of us would sit on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I would feel a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal happiness. We had not just preserved our family's legacy, but had made it relevant and meaningful for a new generation. We had proven that traditional values and modern innovation could coexist, that rural life could be both peaceful and productive. Emma would often curl up in my lap during these evening moments, asking me to tell her stories about her great-grandfather Robert, about the early days of the farm, about the challenges and triumphs that had shaped our family's history. These storytelling sessions had become one of my greatest joys, a way of passing down not just information but wisdom and perspective that couldn't be learned from books or schools. Sarah would listen to these stories too, sometimes adding details she remembered from her own childhood, sometimes asking questions about aspects of our family history she'd never fully understood. The distance that had grown between us during her marriage to Marcus had been completely healed, replaced by a closeness that was deeper and more mature than what we'd shared when she was young. The community had embraced Sarah and Emma in ways that reminded me why rural life had always appealed to people seeking authentic connections and mutual support. Neighbors helped with farm work during busy seasons, shared equipment and expertise, included Emma in youth activities and Sarah in women's organizations that provided both social connection and practical assistance. When Emma started kindergarten at the local elementary school, she was already reading above grade level and could do basic arithmetic from helping with farm store transactions. But more importantly, she had social skills and emotional maturity that impressed her teachers. She was comfortable talking to adults, confident in new situations, capable of working independently or collaborating effectively with other children. The school principal commented to Sarah that Emma had an unusual combination of sophistication and groundedness that made her stand out among her peers. She could discuss complex topics like sustainability and animal welfare with remarkable understanding for her age. But she was also completely comfortable getting dirty during recess or helping younger children with playground conflicts. Sarah had found her niche in the local business community, serving on committees that promoted agricultural tourism and sustainable development. Her marketing expertise and international experience brought fresh perspectives to discussions about how rural communities could thrive in the 21st century economy. She was helping other farmers develop online sales channels and direct-to-consumer marketing strategies that increased their profitability while preserving their traditional operations. The success of our farm store had inspired other local producers to collaborate on regional marketing initiatives. Sarah had helped establish a cooperative arrangement where several farms shared booth space at distant farmers markets, coordinated their planting schedules to ensure diverse product offerings throughout the growing season, and developed shared branding that emphasized the quality and authenticity of locally produced food. These business relationships had created a support network that extended beyond commerce into genuine friendship and mutual assistance. When Emma broke her arm falling from the apple tree behind our house, 3 different neighbors showed up within an hour to help with farm chores Sarah couldn't manage while caring for an injured child. When Sarah needed to travel for a client meeting, there were multiple offers to provide childcare and supervision for Emma. This kind of community support had been one of the things I'd missed most during Sarah's years in London. Cities might offer cultural opportunities and career advancement, but they rarely provided the deep, intergenerational relationships that sustained people through difficult times and celebrated with them during moments of joy and achievement. Emma was developing these relationships naturally, forming connections with adults and children across multiple generations. She had special friendships with elderly neighbors who shared stories and skills from earlier eras, with teenage babysitters who introduced her to current music and fashion trends, with young families who included her in their children's birthday parties and holiday celebrations. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life had given structure and meaning to our days in ways that urban schedules couldn't replicate. Emma understood that spring meant planting and baby animals, that summer brought long days of growth and abundance, that fall required harvesting and preservation of the year's production, that winter provided time for planning and repair and reflection. She was learning patience from watching seeds grow into plants, responsibility from caring for animals that depended on her daily attention, resilience from dealing with weather and pests, and the inevitable disappointments that came with farming. These lessons couldn't be taught in classrooms or learned from textbooks. They required lived experience and direct engagement with the natural world. Sarah had documented much of Emma's development through photography and video, creating a record of her childhood that captured not just major milestones, but the daily moments that revealed her growing understanding of her place in the world. There were pictures of Emma's first successful attempt at gathering eggs without breaking any, videos of her explaining to visitors how tomatoes grew from tiny seeds, recordings of her singing the old songs I'd taught her while we worked in the garden together. These records would become precious to Emma as she grew older, reminders of the foundation that had shaped her character and values. They would also serve as documentation of our family's continued presence on this land, proof that the Anderson legacy was not just being preserved, but actively renewed and extended into the future. The financial security provided by our legal victory over Marcus had allowed us to make improvements to the property that enhanced both its productivity and its appeal as a destination for agritourism. We'd restored the old smokehouse where my grandfather had cured hams and bacon, turning it into a demonstration area where visitors could learn about traditional food preservation methods. We'd rebuilt the stone walls that divided different sections of the property, using techniques that had been employed by the original builders over a century ago. Sarah had researched our family's history more thoroughly than any previous generation, discovering documents and photographs that revealed details about our ancestors' lives and struggles. She'd created displays in the farm store that told the story of 4 generations of Anderson farmers, showing how the operation had evolved while maintaining its essential character and purpose. These historical exhibits had become popular with school groups and historical societies, generating both revenue and recognition for our efforts to preserve agricultural heritage. Emma had become an unofficial tour guide, capable of explaining the different tools and techniques displayed in our farm museum with enthusiasm and accuracy that impressed adult visitors. The success of our educational programming had led to partnerships with universities and agricultural extension services that brought student groups to the farm for hands-on learning experiences. Sarah had developed curriculum materials that aligned with state educational standards, while providing practical demonstrations of scientific and mathematical principles through farming activities. Emma thrived in these teaching situations, helping younger children understand concepts she'd learned through daily experience. She was developing leadership skills and confidence that would serve her well regardless of what direction her life eventually took. Whether she chose to continue the farming tradition or pursue other careers, she would always have the solid foundation of knowledge and values she was acquiring through her rural upbringing. The seasonal events we'd established had become traditions that brought hundreds of visitors to the farm each year. Our spring planting festival taught families about seed starting and garden planning while celebrating the renewal that came with warmer weather. The summer harvest celebrations showcased the diversity and abundance of local food production while providing entertainment and education for all ages. Our fall activities had become particularly popular, featuring pumpkin picking, hay rides, demonstrations of traditional crafts like corn husk doll making, and apple butter production. Sarah had organized these events to highlight the connection between agricultural production and cultural traditions, showing visitors how farming had shaped not just economic life but social customs and artistic expression. Emma was always the star of these events, comfortable interacting with visitors of all ages, eager to share her knowledge about animals and plants, naturally gifted at making people feel welcome and included. She was learning hospitality and communication skills that would serve her well in any future career while developing pride in her family's heritage and achievements. The winter months had become a time for planning and skill development, rather than the period of reduced activity that characterized many farming operations. Sarah had established workshops that taught traditional crafts like quilting, woodworking, and bread making, bringing people to the farm during the season when outdoor activities were limited. These winter programs had created year-round income streams, while preserving knowledge and skills that might otherwise be lost as older generations passed away. Emma was learning from master craftspeople, who shared techniques developed over decades of practice, acquiring abilities that connected her to the pre-industrial traditions that had sustained rural communities for centuries. The success of our diversified operation had attracted attention from agricultural researchers and rural development specialists, who saw our farm as a model for how traditional operations could adapt to modern economic realities without losing their essential character. Sarah had been invited to speak at conferences and workshops sharing our strategies for combining production agriculture with education and tourism. This recognition had brought opportunities for grants and partnerships that further enhanced our ability to serve both our local community and visitors from urban areas seeking authentic experiences and education about food production. We'd received funding for improvements to our facilities, support for our educational programming, and assistance with marketing our products to broader markets. But the most meaningful recognition had come from our neighbors and community members who had watched our family weather crisis and emerged stronger than ever. The respect and admiration we'd earned through our perseverance and commitment to our values was worth more than any external awards or financial success. Emma had become something of a local celebrity, known throughout the county for her knowledge of farming and her ability to articulate the importance of agricultural heritage. She'd been featured in newspaper articles and television segments that highlighted the success of our educational programs and the uniqueness of our approach to preserving family farming traditions. This attention hadn't gone to her head. Sarah had worked carefully to help Emma understand that recognition was the result of hard work and commitment to helping others, not something to be sought for its own sake. Emma remained grounded and focused on the daily responsibilities and relationships that gave meaning to her life. The relationships Emma had developed with her great aunts and great uncles on Robert's side of the family had become precious to all of us. These elderly relatives had initially been concerned about Sarah's decision to leave London and return to rural life, worried that she was making choices based on emotion rather than practical considerations. But seeing Emma's development and Sarah's success had converted them into enthusiastic supporters of our lifestyle choices. They'd become regular visitors to the farm, contributing their own memories and skills to our educational programming, while enjoying the opportunity to share their knowledge with a new generation. Emma's relationship with these older relatives was providing her with perspectives on family history and community life that extended far beyond what Sarah and I could offer. She was learning about the Great Depression from people who had lived through it, about World War II from veterans who had served overseas, about the changes in agricultural technology from farmers who had worked with horses before tractors became common. These intergenerational connections were giving Emma a sense of continuity and belonging that many children never experience. She understood that she was part of something larger than her immediate family, connected to a community and a way of life that had sustained people through good times and bad for many generations. The values she was learning through these relationships would guide her decision-making throughout her life, regardless of what career path she eventually chose. She was developing respect for elderly people, appreciation for hard work and perseverance, understanding of how communities support their members through mutual aid and cooperation. Sarah had documented many of these intergenerational interactions, creating video recordings that would preserve the voices and stories of older community members for future generations. These recordings had become treasures for our local historical society, providing first-hand accounts of community life and agricultural practices that might otherwise be lost. Emma had learned to operate the recording equipment and often conducted her own interviews with visitors and relatives, asking questions that revealed her natural curiosity about how people had lived and worked in earlier times. She was developing research and communication skills while contributing to the preservation of local history and culture. The success of our operation had generated interest from young people who were considering careers in agriculture or rural community development. Sarah had developed internship programs that brought college students and recent graduates to the farm for hands-on experience with sustainable agriculture and agritourism operations. These interns brought fresh energy and ideas to our work, while learning practical skills and gaining exposure to alternative career paths that many young people never considered. Several had gone on to establish their own operations modeled on our approach, extending our influence beyond our own community. Emma enjoyed interacting with these young adults, learning from their perspectives and energy while serving as a bridge between generations. She was comfortable explaining our methods and philosophy to people barely older than children themselves, developing teaching skills and confidence that would serve her well in any future leadership roles. The network of farms and businesses that had grown around our success had created economic opportunities that were helping to revitalize our entire region. Young families were moving back to rural areas that had been losing population for decades, attracted by the combination of economic opportunity and quality of life that our collaborative approach had made possible. Emma was growing up in a community that was growing rather than declining, surrounded by optimism and innovation rather than the resignation and decline that characterized many rural areas. She was seeing that traditional ways of life could be preserved and adapted rather than abandoned, that rural communities could thrive in the modern economy while maintaining their essential character. The long-term impact of our success extended far beyond our own family's security and happiness. We had proven that determined individuals could protect their values and heritage while adapting to changing circumstances, that community cooperation could overcome the challenges posed by economic consolidation and cultural change. Emma would carry these lessons with her throughout her life, equipped with both practical skills and philosophical perspectives that would help her navigate whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring. Whether she chose to continue the farming tradition or pursue other careers, she would always understand the importance of community, the value of hard work, and the satisfaction that comes from contributing to something larger than oneself. As I watched her playing in the meadow that warm summer evening, surrounded by the landscape that had shaped 4 generations of our family, I felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal achievement. We had not just survived Marcus's attempts to destroy us, but had used the experience to become stronger and more purposeful in our commitment to the values that had always sustained us. The farm was secure, legally protected, and financially stable for generations to come. Our family was united, bound together by shared experiences and common purpose rather than just blood relationships. Our community was thriving, benefiting from the example we'd set and the opportunities we'd created. Most importantly, Emma was growing up with the confidence and knowledge she would need to make her own choices about her future, while remaining connected to the foundation that had given her life meaning and direction. She would always know where she came from and what she was capable of achieving through hard work and determination. The sun was setting behind the old oak tree where Robert was buried, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple that reminded me why I had never wanted to leave this place. Emma came running toward the house, her cheeks flushed from playing, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that comes from being completely at home in your environment. Sarah called from the garden that dinner was almost ready, her voice carrying across the fields that had fed our family for over a century. The sounds of our life together, the sight of Emma's carefree happiness, the knowledge that we had protected what mattered most to us from those who would have destroyed it for their own purposes. All of this filled me with a contentment that money could never buy. The battle was over. The victory was complete. Our family's legacy was secure for generations to come. And Emma would grow up knowing that love and determination could triumph over wealth and power, that families who stood together could weather any storm, that the values that had sustained rural communities for centuries were still relevant and powerful in the modern world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.